Hello, Tom Maguire. So I just want to do a book review on the Peregrine by J.A. Baker. Now, this is an absolutely superb book. It was written in 1967. I came across this book whilst I was doing some research on James Rebanks, the guy who did this fantastic book, which I reviewed before. Yeah, so I kind of stumbled across it really. I'd never heard of it before, which I was quite surprised about in some ways actually, because it seems to have become a bit more popular again in recent years. It was kind of almost not necessarily forgotten about, but kind of sort of more popular recently. I think it was republished in like 2006 or something. I will correct myself on that. I'll edit it in afterwards if that's wrong. But I've seen quite a lot of crap on this, pretentious kind of crap written about this book and spoken about this book. And people like to go on using flowery language and overdoing it and kind of just trying to be as poetic as possible. And there's really no point, because you're not going to be as poetic and fantastic with words as J.A. Baker is in this book, basically. He's just absolutely fantastic. And it kind of makes me laugh because I looked on Goodreads. I typed it into Google and it came up on Goodreads. There was a review there by Kobe Bryant, and he sadly died. I think it was last year, or it might have been the year before. I think it was last year. And he basically, his review basically says he walks around and looks at birds and writes about them real good. And yeah, you've got the usual kind of sycophants underneath saying the best review ever and all this sort of stuff. But it did make me laugh. I just thought it's actually kind of a perfect description really of the book. That kind of sums it up. You know, you could stop listening to this review and that's basically all you need to know. He basically walks around looking at birds and writes about them fantastically. And you might think that's really boring. What's the point in that? But if you're someone who appreciates good writing and imagery and metaphor and kind of really interesting comment on life and death and what it is to be human and to be animal, it's just absolutely fantastic. And I don't want to be pretentious now, but it's just such a deep kind of, it's the kind of impactful book. It's the kind of book that is going to shape the rest of the year for me in terms of the books that I read. I quite like nature writing anyway. I'm very interested in nature. I find being out in nature really important for my well-being. I love exercising, going running, cycling. I like being solitary from time to time. I'm a very social person. I have my family, my friends. I like to be around people, but I like time for me as well. So being out in nature is really important. And J.A. Baker was someone who we knew very little about until very recently. He was very private. If you look at do some research, he was very private. He didn't want any kind of fame or kind of recognition for his work. So we didn't know very much about him at all until recently. I think like the last 10 years or so, something like that. And I don't think they even knew his name. I think it's John Alec Baker. But yeah, he was apparently very solitary. He lived in Essex, and where the book is kind of set is the countryside around Essex, basically. I think he kind of kept diary entries, and then this book is kind of made up from those diary entries. Some bird experts have apparently said that what he says isn't necessarily accurate, that you wouldn't necessarily find peregrines in the places that he said he'd find them, and some of the kills that he found things weren't necessarily accurate. But then other people have kind of said that maybe actually he was so obsessed and so focused on his passion of birds that actually he developed a more accurate, more keen eye than anyone else. So you've got these other so-called experts who are kind of trying to do him down, but actually, it could be kind of poetic license that he's using, which is absolutely fine, obviously, because it is a book that we read for pleasure. Anyway, it's not necessarily a factual book. But B, it's actually perfectly possible, and I quite like this idea, that because he was so passionate and so single-minded and focused on his subject, that actually he's transcended all the other so-called experts, and actually he's discovered things that other people wouldn't necessarily have discovered. So it's kind of gone against that kind of convention, tradition, I suppose. And I quite like that idea, because I think that's very relevant to human potential, which is something that I'm really interested in. It's also very close to kind of autism and Asperger's and things as well, which I find really interesting. You know, some people with Asperger's or autism have kind of specialist subjects that they're really, really interested in, really, really focused on. And actually there is an argument, isn't there, in personal development, that when you focus on something enough, even Jordan Peterson says this, he says that you should try to pick something that you're interested in and kind of focus all your efforts on it and see how good you can get at it. because that's often how people kind of get to that stage of expertise and kind of uncovering stuff that we hadn't sort of known before. So there's something very interesting in that. And he is basically just a man who is really, really passionate about his birds, about the peregrine. And he just writes in such a fantastic way. And there's not really much else to say about it, except there is, because I want to keep talking about it, because I just found it so interesting. They reckon it was written during the winter of 62-63, which was a really, really severe winter in England. I think the sea froze for like 100 odd metres out or something, maybe even further than that. And because of the way it's written and where it's written, although I found it really beautiful, at times I found it quite bleak as well. I suppose being English, I've got quite a good understanding of the English countryside. I've been to Essex quite a few times. I lived in London for quite a while. And I guess I imagined being back in the 60s during that time. And I imagined it to just be a little bit cold and lonely and kind of bleak in a way. But I like that as well. It kind of gave it that bit of contrast. There are times it was fantastically sort of beautiful with sunsets being described and things like that. And other times where it just felt a bit cold and lonely. But I think that was just really, really good, really interesting, really just such good writing, such good prose. I'm going to read you a couple of bits from the book as well. So, there aren't really any spoilers in this review. There can't be really for this kind of book. It's a very unique kind of book. I can say what I like about it, but you have to read it for yourself to experience it. It really is an experience. It's the sort of book that I can imagine myself reading again when I'm an old man and kind of sat out in a garden, maybe in the sunshine with a hat on and a nice drink, and just kind of being a bit nostalgic and just reading it and just kind of enjoying nature and fresh air and being out amongst it. I can imagine that. I think it's definitely a book I will certainly read again at some point. One of the things he says then, I've always longed to be a part of the outward life, to be out there at the edge of things, to let the human taint wash away in emptiness and silence as the fox sloughs his smell into the cold unworldliness of water, to return to the town as a stranger, wandering flushes a glory that fades with arrival. It's just absolutely fantastic. I just can't really kind of say much more about it. The peregrine's view of land is like the yachtsman's view of the shore as he sails into the long estuaries. A wake of water recedes behind him. The wake of the pierced horizon glides back on either side. Like the seafarer, the peregrine lives in a pouring away world of no attachment. A world of wakes and tilting, of sinking plains of land and water. We who are anchored and earthbound cannot envisage this freedom of the eye. And it's almost as if he's and lots of other people have said this as well, so I'm kind of just repeating it, but it's very much as if he kind of wants to transcend himself and become like the peregrine. And he wants to fly, he wants to be free of kind of the limitations of being human. He talks about he says, we are the killers, we stink of death, we carry it with us, it sticks to us like frost, we cannot tear it away. And there's quite a lot of this sort of writing about being human and how we're kind of unable just to exist in nature in the way that these animals are. And he says how the seal has a better existence than us because it's got the element of water to sustain it, and we don't have an element to sustain us. And lots of people argue that it's almost like he's becoming the peregrine at some points. It's just really interesting, and the way he plays with words and stuff is just absolutely fantastic. It's also it's also a bit environmentalist as well, which is really interesting. He's kind of seeing the kind of destruction of the countryside, and around the time that he was living there, the countryside was getting decimated. Hundreds of miles of countryside hedge, as we talked about in James Rebank's book, was destroyed after the war. The hedgerows were just absolutely, taken out, and he could see it becoming so much less. And I think he possibly said in one of the interviews they recovered, or possibly one of his diaries, he said about how it's never going to be the same. It's not the same as it was when he was young, sort of thing. So there's that sadness, that feeling of sadness to it as well. So yeah, the fact that DDT gets into the system and starts thinning out Peregrine's eggs and causes all sorts of damage. It's horrible. Fear releases power. Man might be more tolerable, less fractious and smug if he had more to fear. I do not mean fear of the intangible, the suffocation of the introvert, but physical fear, cold sweating fear for one's life. Fear of the unseen, menacing beast, imminent, bristly, tusked and terrible, ravening for one's own hot, saline blood. Just such good writing, and it is like it the whole way through. It's not kind of tokenistic here and there. The whole thing. It's a difficult book to kind of remember because it just flows almost like a dream. And that is just what makes it so fantastic. And you, like I said early on, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's boring. Who the hell wants to read about a weird, potentially weird man walking around on his own observing birds? Well, actually, isn't nature just the most kind of fascinating thing when you actually stop to think about it? When you don't stop to think about it, you just kind of flippantly observe it, then maybe it is really boring, but actually it's fascinating if you kind of get your mind into it and start thinking a bit more deeply. And it's just the way he writes, relating himself to the situation. He doesn't describe himself. You hear very little, if anything at all, about himself or the way he's dressed or anything like that. It's just literally his journeys. It reminds me a little bit actually of what's it called? My Teacher the Octopus, or My Octopus Teacher on Netflix. And I wonder if that was a little bit inspired by it, thinking about it. That's literally just come to me now, actually. My Octopus Teacher on Netflix. I saw that a few months ago, and that's fantastic. And it's very much like that, actually. And I think they've talked about making it into a film and stuff, and people have said, no. Werner Herzog, who's basically a kind of literary intellectual Arnold Schwarzenegger, basically. Look him up on YouTube. He sounds like Arnie. It's quite funny. But he's really interestingly talking about this book. And I have to admit, I didn't know who he was, actually, until I read this book and saw some of the reviews on YouTube. But he seems like a really interesting guy. I've just bought one of his books. I think it's called On Walking in Ice. Very short book of when he went to visit one of his friends who was dying, and he walked across Germany, I think it was. So that sounds really interesting. So yeah, look him up, Werner. I think it's Werner Herzog. He's a German film director, and he's written lots of books as well. He's really, considered an intellectual, really interesting guy. And he talks about it, and he gives, a far better review than I possibly could. Far more interesting, to be fair. But just such a fantastic book. I highly recommend this one to everyone, really. There are some people who will hate it because they just won't get it. And I don't mean that in a patronising way, I'm just being honest. Some people will just be like, what the hell's that about? I'm not interested in that at all. And that's fair enough. But I think the people who do enjoy it will absolutely love it. It's one of the best books I've ever read, for sure. It's without doubt a 5-star. I wouldn't dare to say it was any less than a 5-star, simply because it's just unmatched, I think, in terms of how well written and how interestingly written, I would say. I would say, rather than well written necessarily, because I'm not someone to judge on how well written something is, I would say how uniquely written it is, because it's just has its really interesting, unique style, and I think that's what makes it stand out for me. So absolutely fantastic book. Cannot recommend it enough. Speak very soon. Take care.